Okay, we'll get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to DFI's Impact webinar. The webinar is hosted by DFI's Driven Pile Committee to highlight developments, current practices, and case studies focused on driven pile foundations. If you have a topic that might benefit the industry, please reach out and volunteer yourself or volunteer one of your colleagues to present. My name is Travis Coleman. I work for GRL Engineers out of Chicago. Few quick rules here. So everyone will be automatically muted during the presentation. If you have questions, please use the question and answer function within the Zoom options. I'll monitor those questions, and at the end of the presentation, we will run through those questions with our presenters. PDHs will be available to those who have paid for those certificates. And here's the directions on registering for. Oh no, that's to register for the other webinar. Sorry about that. Web link and instructions will be sent to your email address. Once again, if you did pay for the PDH certificate. Okay, so we're very excited for today's presentation as it's a topic that's frequently discussed within this committee, that topic being vibrations of existing structures adjacent to pile installation operations. Brent and Kathy have some field experimentation at multiple sites that provide a wealth of additional knowledge on this topic. So thanks to Brent Mines and Dr. Kathy Aimone-Martin. And with that, you have the controls, Brent.
My name is Brent Mines. I'm with Detecht out of Colorado. We're a vibration monitoring and instrumentation company. And I worked for a long time with my co-presenter, Dr. Kathy Aimone-Martin of Aimone-Martin Associates. She was a professor at New Mexico Tech, where I did my graduate studies. And today we get to talk about vibrations from pile driving, some kind of unique opportunities that we had to drive piles very close to some structures and instrument and gather a lot of different types of data. So our study goal here was to find a couple of structures where we could drive piles extremely close to the structures. So we found two that were actually going to be demolished, one house and one larger structure, and got to drive piles up to 4 or 5 feet away from the building. And then we put a lot of instruments on the building, got a lot of different types of data on the structure and also in the ground. And so we're looking for kind of a couple of things, but the goal of this study that we're in the middle of is to get some extremely close in vibration data in response to the structures. But then the second part, which we plan to do in the future, is to find some sandy sites and study more about the vibration transmission in the ground and how that relates to settlement potential. And that's critically important for structures also. So yeah, we're measuring vibrations on the structure and at depth in the ground, and we're focusing on strain in the structure and in the ground also. And the goal is to gather as much different types of data as we can and kind of pull it all together from multiple sources, kind of something that hasn't been done before as far as both the PDA and crack response and structure response and ground vibration all together in one place. So the first structure that we had the opportunity to instrument was this house that was owned by the Rumpke Quarry just north of Cincinnati, Ohio. They were planning to mine through this area as part of the quarry operations. So they're going to demolish a structure. And we started to instrument it as part of a blasting study on blast vibrations, knowing that they were approaching closely with the explosive blasting operations. And then kind of morphed into a study for pile driving vibration also. The structure is a poured concrete basement, a wood frame upper story with a brick and mortar exterior. This is the map showing where it was relative to the quarry operations as they progressed from the north. They demolished a house, and I think they are soon to be mining through that area if they haven't already by now. We began by characterizing the ground that's under the house with a borehole, split spoon, samples, and blow counts. It's primarily fill for the first 10 feet and then transitions into clay. And then the top of the rock was about 19, 20 feet down. It was a shale, weathered for the top foot or so, and then became pretty competent. And that's the material that they were mining for the quarry, and then eventually turned into a landfill. They backfilled the whole quarry operations with garbage from Cincinnati. Then the next characterization of the site was wave speed measurements with arrays of geophones and active sources there. The results are on the right side. They show mainly 3 different kind of regions of wave speed, where there's the upper fill for the near surface part, the clay layer, and then the speed jumps up for the rock that's down there. The depths were just a little bit different from at the house because the ground kind of sloped away from the top of the hill where the house was sitting. So you can see the top of the rock, and this plot is about 17 feet. And then this is the pile driving plan. It's a plan view of the building with 3 bedrooms, living room, and kitchen. And the plan was to drive 8 piles between 5 feet and 20 feet out from the building in 2 lines that were separated by 10 feet apart. The A line was impact with the diesel impact hammer, and then the B line was vibratory driving. And then there was a vibratory extraction of each one after it was driven in. The first of the vibration instrumentation was just an array of geophones on the surface, 2 arrays going to the north and to the east, out to 180 feet, provided by Geosonics, Fibertech, and my team had a set also. And then to measure vibrations deeper into the ground, we drilled and installed a vertical array of geophones right between the 2 lines, 5 feet away from the house and 5 feet away from both of the closest sets of piles. These are borehole type geophones that we taped onto a PVC pipe to maintain orientation and make sure all the geophones are oriented the same direction with the house. And then it was drilled down to 25 feet, about 5 feet into the rock. And then the red dots here are the locations of the borehole geophones. At the surface, 1 feet below the surface level, and then 7, 13, 19, and 25 feet down. The basement of the building went down about 10 feet. And as you can see here, this cross section, the borehole geophones are right between the 2 lines of piles. We also had PDA information provided by GRL for this one. If you're not familiar with PDA, it's an accelerometer and a strain gauge that get affixed to the pile near the top. And with each blow of the hammer, a single vibration wave is sent down the pile and back up, bounce off the end that's in the ground and comes back up. And using wave equations, those 2 sensors can kind of glean a lot of information about what's going on in the pile at the top and at the bottom. And we'll talk more about that at the end. But it was kind of a unique opportunity for us to kind of tie together the PDA data with the vibration information and everything else. For the structure, something that Kathy and I both worked on was mainly measuring global strain in the structure. And the way that we do that is with a geophone at the top and the bottom of the structure. So S2 is what we call the upper structure, and S1 is the lower structure. And these are velocity geophones that we integrate the velocity record into displacement and then subtract those out to compute differential displacement between S1 and S2. And then we can look at global shear strain across the walls there by the deformation between those 2 points, and then calculate global tensile strain as an elongation of the diagonal kind of length of 2 sides of the building with the measurements on the corner. And then the units for this are very small levels of strains. We're talking about micro strains. So 10 to the -6 change in inches divided by the original length in inches. This is what it looked like inside of that corner bedroom where the sensors were. We attached the geophones to the frames right in the corner there, and then the pile driving took place basically right outside that window. And then with all the different sensors that we had in the borehole and on the structure, we had a lot of different seismographs in this closet of the bedroom, all time correlated, co-triggered, so that we had each one on a common time basis, and we could do these kind of whole structure analysis and correlations. We also had crack monitoring going inside of the hallway. In the center of the house, there was a crack that ran up the two walls and across the ceiling, connecting the two sides of the hallway together. And so we had two different types of displacement type gauges over the crack. One was an eddy current displacement gauge, and another was an LVDT. And we had one gauge over the crack itself, and then one gauge over an uncracked section of the wall right next to it as a control. And then we correlated the crack opening and closing over a long period of time, several months, with temperature and humidity measurements inside the structure and out. And then also recorded a fast dynamic crack response during the blasting, vibrations, and the pile driving. One of the more difficult parts of it, but also the most critical, was trying to understand how all this information that we're getting from the electronic sensors tied back to what was actually going on with the pile and where the pile tip depth was in relation to each one of these measurements. And so we had a lot of different people measuring and recording and observing and taking notes the whole time. DRW, S&ME, GRL, and Kathy was out there too. Everybody was taking notes to make sure that we know that all the data that we had, exactly what depth the pile was at for each minute or so as the pile went down to the ground. The pile driving equipment, we had two different pieces of equipment, a diesel impact hammer, a D1942, and a vibratory driver, an ICE 44B. And they were both driving, we had the same 4 piles for both sides, 14 by 73 H piles, 25 feet long. And Goddell was very nice to provide the entire pile driving crew, the crane, the whole setup and everything. And they came in, and this little tiny yard next to the house brought in this old crane, and just over a couple of days got everything set up. We drove all the piles and extracted them in 2 days, but they were there for pretty much a whole week, setting it all up and making it happen. So this is what it looked like driving the impact piles. We started at 20 feet away and then worked closer up until the closest one was 5 feet from the structure. And the piles were 25 feet long, and they were basically driven down until they just wouldn't go anymore when they hit the top of the rock at about 20 feet down. And then at the top of the rock, we still drove it a little bit more just to get the absolute worst case kind of situation of vibrations that are created with maximum resistance in the pile, and just continuing to hit it and seeing how much vibration was created on the surface and how much transmitted into the structure. But what happened was that by smashing the piles into the top of the rock over and over again, was that the tips got deformed and buckled, and they kind of locked into the top of the rock a little bit too. So when we went to vibratory extract the piles, it was really difficult. We actually started up the ICE driver vibrating and pulled with the maximum capacity of the crane, and they didn't come out at first. So it just kind of sat there for a few minutes, vibrating back and forth while I was pulling on it, and then eventually it kind of loosened up a little bit and came up out of the ground. But then we reused these piles for the second line for the vibratory installation, and but before that, they did cut off the bottom couple feet of the pile to make sure there was a clean tip for inserting the next line. And then this is what it looked like installing the second line. This one we started with the closest pile, 5 feet away from the structure. And I think this is one of my favorite pictures from the whole project, because you can see that that big old vibratory hammer is basically touching the gutters of the house right there. We got as close as we could possibly get to the building to try to get worst case vibrations into that building and just see what happens. I was standing inside the bedroom there monitoring the instruments while the vibratory driving was going on. And as you can see in the video here, it actually doesn't look like that much. We kind of expected, like, it's hard to represent it visually, even with a cup of water there showing how much vibration it is. But it's very deceiving because it's standing there, feeling it on my body. I gotta tell you, it really was an uncomfortable level of vibration. Like, it went on for about 5 minutes, whole time pushing those piles into the ground. And yeah, it's not something that I wanted to experience for very long, because even just kind of looking at the walls, my eyeballs were jiggling so much back and forth that I had a hard time focusing on things. So yeah, it was a lot of vibration there. And yep. The other pictures here show how we went back, started 5 feet away, then 10, 15, and 20 feet back from the house. All right, so here's the first part of some of the results that we got. This is the PDA data that computes the total resistance at the tip of the pile and then correlates that with depth. So as you can see, we kind of tried to tie that back to the results of the soil testing. And then we could see some of the layers that were present in the ground. Around 9-10 feet is when it transitioned from fill into that clay. And then there was a couple of kind of harder layers in the clay. We started to get a little bit of sandy, darker clay that's harder and stiffer. And then the top of the rock right there at 19 feet was also the water level. And kind of looking at this all together, there was 3 regions of kind of increase of resistance as the pile was going down into the ground. And that actually lined up just about perfectly with the 3 regions that we saw in the wave speed measurements. So because of the elevations and the wave speed measurement was done just downhill from the house a little bit, we just moving the actual absolute depth by a foot or two, it lined up really nicely where these 3 regions of increase of power resistance lined up with the 3 different jumps of wave speed. And then the actual vibration measurements on the surface right there next to the house. So we call this a compliance measurement point because this is what's used usually for showing compliance with the U.S. Bureau of Mines recommended safe vibration standard. That criteria is the black line that's shown there. It's a combination of peak particle velocity, PPV, and frequency. And it's required to have the sensor outside the building in the ground, usually 5 feet away from the building. So that's why this geophone represents the compliance, and it would be what you would show if you were doing pile driving normally next to a structure and you had one sensor there to show whether you were below the limit or above. And in this case, the impact driving, which is the red dots there, were significantly above the line. We had a maximum of 2.2 inches per second PPV, which is about 1.4 times the limit. And then the worst case vibration that we got the whole time, because those piles were kind of locked into the top of the rock, was when we went to vibratory extract those piles. The highest vibration we got the whole project was 4.1 inches per second on pulling out those first line of piles. And that's about 2 times the limit. And then vibratory driving in those the next line of piles, the maximum was 3.8 inches per second, but those are the red dots there, but it was at a slightly lower frequency, so it ended up being about 2.1 times the limit here. And then the vibratory extracting of those ones that didn't get bashed as much into the top of the rock was 2.6, about 1.4 times the limit. So we did achieve the goal that we were looking for with this project, which was to significantly vibrate the house above the normal limit that we use for the protection of drywall. And we think that these two, because of the ground resistance, because it was really stiff clay, and because we actually drove the piles into rock, it does represent the maximum kind of vibrations that you can create by pile driving in almost an absolute sense, because this ground is so stiff and competent that you wouldn't ever even be pile driving in this type of soil. So by having higher resistance than you normally would for pile driving, it represents a worst case beyond what is even a normal operating condition for pile driving so that we could generate the worst case, the highest possible vibrations from this type of machine, and then to see what it does to the structure. These are the results from the surface arrays that went out to 180 feet. This is a plot of PPV versus distance away from the pile. And the 0.75 inches per second is the lower frequency limit for the drywall protection, part of the USBM. And then 3 inches per second is the red line there that we often use for mortar materials. So putting in an upper bound, kind of worst case prediction line for this, we can see at what distance crosses those two different thresholds, 18 feet for the 0.75 and 7.1 feet for the mortar. So this is a kind of an analysis that we often do when we expect pile driving to be closest in structures. We'll do this as a kind of test case at the beginning of a project when we can drive some piles farther from the structures, and then use this plot to recommend to the operators kind of a safe operating distance for this equipment to make sure that we're keeping below the limit at the closest structures. So in this case, we would have recommended to them that they keep this pile driving with the diesel impact, the Delmeg hammer, at least 19 or 20 feet away from the structures. And then that kind of tracks with what we got, because we drove 5 feet away, we did get 2.1 times the limit. So yeah. Next we have the crack response inside the house. On the top there is the vibratory extracting, where we had the highest vibration in the ground. We also saw the highest crack response. When the vibratory hammer is starting up, it kind of ramps through some different frequencies that are a little bit lower. And so the structure doesn't respond, the structure responds more at the lower frequencies. And so that's why we have the highest crack response is during the startup time, where we saw 651 micro-inch crack opening and closing. And then once it got into a steady state, higher frequency, then we saw 506 micro-inch at the most. And then the vibratory was more impactful to the crack in the structure than the impact driving, because the impact driving had a little bit higher frequency and there were just these individual hits. So it didn't resonate maybe as much with the structure. So the maximum crack opening from the impact driving was 190 micro-inches. We also compared the long-term crack opening and closing to the vibratory effects. And so this is the plot over 150 days or so. And you can see that the overall change is over the 75 days where this data set was, the largest change from top to bottom was 18,000 micro-inches, or that's 0.018 inches over 75 days. And then at one point over just a 12-hour period, the highest was about 10,000 micro-inches. So a storm came in, the humidity changed drastically, temperature changed, something like that. And then comparing that to the highest pile driving effect, which was 651 micro-inches, you can see that the weather in the end had a much, much larger effect on actually straining and making this crack open and close. For structure strains, just kind of as a background, we use a different strains. There's been some laboratory testing of what kind of strains it takes to crack different metric materials. So these are the 4 kind of categories of materials that we look at when we were considering the vibration susceptibility of different buildings materials. So the weakest one is going to be old plaster, usually a lath and plaster wall, which can crack at low as 105 microstrain. But then in this case, we didn't have any plaster in this house, so we're going to focus on drywall, which can crack at 200 to 300 microstrain, and then masonry walls can crack at 700, and concrete 3,000 plus. So when we do our strain analysis of the vibration-induced strain in the building, this is what it looks like. The red line is the lower structure S1, and then the black line is the upper structure S2. And by subtracting those out from each other, we get the differential. And then using the geometry of the building, we can calculate the shear strain and the tensile strain. So in this case, one of these events was a PPV of 1.42 inches per second. And that resulted in the highest strain throughout the whole study, which was 12.8 microstrain from the impact hammer. And then for the vibratory hammer, the highest strain was 38.1 microstrain. And yeah, that wasn't the highest vibration event in the ground, but close to it, where it was 3.6 instead of the highest we recorded was 4.1. And yeah, you can see that the upper structure, especially in this lower plot for the north wall, the upper structure moves a lot more than the lower structure. And that's probably because this was during the ramp up kind of frequency phase of the hammer starting. So for a few seconds there, the hammer is going pretty close to the natural frequency of the building. And so you do get some amplification in the upper structure relative to the lower structure. And so that's why the vibratory impact hammer, or the vibratory hammer, was a higher strain overall induced in the structure than the impact hammer. But the important thing is to relate these back to what it takes to actually crack some of the materials in the wall. So if we're looking at drywall at a minimum cracking threshold of 200 microstrain, then neither of these exceeded that. The highest from the impact was 22.5, and from the vibratory was 38.1. So based on that, even though we were driving 5 feet from the structure and we were exceeding the normal US Bureau of Mines limit for drywall by more than 2 times, the strains in the building just weren't there to induce new cracking in the drywall and mortar, because the computed strains, how much the structure was actually being stretched by the vibration, was below what the laboratory test tells us it takes to crack those different materials. And that bore out in our observations too. Even in those bedrooms that were right there, right next 5 feet away from the pile driving, there were no new drywall cracks in those bedrooms or anywhere else in the house. And there was no existing cracks that elongated. The only kind of changes that we saw in the building was in this existing crack that was in the ceiling of the drywall of the hallway. It was clear that the 2 sides of the crack had moved back and forth relative to each other. And so there was some kind of fraying and lifting of the paint along the edges of that, and maybe a little bit more of new sagging right there. So it could be that this piece of drywall is not very well connected to the roof rafters right there. So it was allowed to move a little bit more. It could have been why the crack originally formed in that particular spot in the house to begin with. And then the only other changes that we saw in the house were 2 nail pops in the living room, in the ceiling right next to the wall. And so this was a kind of in the center of the house also, but back away from where the pile driving were. And yeah, they didn't even really break through all the way to the of the paint, but we could see that they were new, bulging out of the ceiling there a little bit. But yeah, there was a good dozen people right there. We scoured the whole house several times, took hundreds of pictures, and these were the only kind of changes that we observed. The fraying of the existing crack in the ceiling, and then 2 new nail pops. So now moving on to the ground. This is the vertical array of borehole geophones that we had again. 5 sensors going from the surface down to 25 feet in fill, and then medium stiff clay, very stiff clay, and then the rock at 20 feet. And this was it took a lot of time to kind of pull all this together, because we had hundreds and hundreds of individual vibration records, and then we had all those notes from the different people trying to record exactly what time the tip of the pile was at what depth. And so it took a long time to put this one plot together, but the results I think are really interesting. The red line is the measurement, the particle velocity as measured at the surface geophone. And then you could see how it changes with depth. The highest vibrations are, there's a kind of a bump out of high vibrations right when the pile tip is near the surface, and then it goes pretty smoothly through that upper layer of fill down to 9-10 feet. And then when it hits the harder clay, the vibrations spike up again. And then after that, as far as the surface geophones are concerned, the vibrations kind of die away as the tip of the pile gets farther and farther from the sensor itself. And then, so the opposite is true for the deeper sensors. If we look at the green line here, that's the sensor that's at 19 feet. So that geophone was placed just above the top of the rock. And when the tip of the pile is 19 feet away, essentially, the tip of the pile starting at the surface is pretty far from the sensor itself. So the vibrations start out really low. And then as the tip of the pile approaches closer to the sensor, the vibrations start to peak up. And you see the same type of bumps that we saw in the pile tip resistance at 9-10 feet, where the transition into the different clay begins. And then around 14 and 16 feet, there's two bumps that we saw the same way in the tip pile resistance. But then the vibrations really spike up, and we saw the highest vibration of all of these borehole sensors was right at the top of the rock, that green line again, right when the pile tip was at the top of the rock. And that's where it peaked out at about 5 inches per second, when the sensor is 5 feet away horizontally from the tip of the pile, but and then the pile tip and the sensor at the same elevation, 19 feet there. One of the really interesting things was a difference between the green line and the orange line, where the vibration just above the top of the rock was really high, but then the vibration of the orange line was surprisingly low by comparison. So it shows that there wasn't a whole lot of transmission of vibration from the soil into the rock, going deeper into the ground past the tip of the pile. Where the green line peaked at 5 inches per second, the orange line peaked at about 0.9 inches per second. So that was kind of a surprising result, that even though that 25-foot sensor was just a few feet away from the tip of the pile, there was a big reduction in the vibration transmission from the clay into the rock. And then one other kind of type of information that was interesting that came out of the PDA data was computed ground strain. So the wave equations from the PDA information, they can compute the strain at the tip of the pile based on the vibration traveling down and then back up to the sensors. And then we could also compute strain in the ground from the geophones as well. So strain in the ground is computed in that equation in the upper right. It's a particle velocity divided by the wave speed, and that gives a unitless strain. And we had the wave speed from the wave speed measurements at the 3 different layers. So this is the wave speed at the location of the sensor. And then the particle velocity we had plotted from the previous plot with depth as the pile goes down into the ground. So the highest ground strain that we saw was from the surface geophone, the red line. And that maximum was about 9-10 feet right there. And that makes sense because the nearer the surface, the ground is less confined because there's a free surface at the top. And then as you get deeper into the ground is more confined. The ground gets denser and harder, the wave speed goes up, so the strain goes down, even though the particle velocity vibrations might go up. The interesting thing here was that for some reason, the PDA ground strain tracked very closely with the 7-foot depth geophone ground strain. So you can see the dashed black line is from the PDA, and the blue line is from the 7-foot geophone, 7-foot deep geophone. And those two tracked very closely with each other. I don't know for sure why that is, but an interesting result. And then the deeper sensors, 19 and 25 feet, even though the vibrations were high at those depths, they were down in the rock where the wave speed was higher, so the ground strain itself was not as high. But it was interesting to see how we see the same kind of bumps in exactly the same kind of depths related to what's actually in the ground. You can see the fill layer down to 9 feet, and then there's a bump up in the strain. And then you can clearly see where the clay, and then especially where the rock is. the strain starts to bump up a bit too. And then this was kind of the culmination of all that put together, is that we measured the ground strain at 5 different depth going down from the surface, and then we measured it horizontally out from 4 different piles at different distances away from the vertical array of sensors. And then putting that together, we can make this cross section of kind of a ground strain profile. A cross section in the ground going out horizontally away from the pile itself and going down right next to the pile. And then these different regions are a representation of settlement potential if the ground was sand. So it's clear in this site there was no settlement at all because it was stiff clay. There wasn't even a risk of settlement. But if in sandy ground, the literature has shown that these 4 different regions relate to no risk of settlement to low, moderate, and then high settlement risk when the ground strain is over 1,000 microstrain or 0.1%. And so we can see, and this is a site-specific kind of profile. So we would expect it would be different for different ground conditions. And we're looking forward to do this at the other site, but we haven't done that analysis yet. But the region of high settlement risk went out to about 4 feet horizontally from the pile and down to about 20 feet. And that's probably just because the rock was right there at 20 feet. That's something we need to test and see how these curves look at a different site that maybe goes deeper in different types of ground. But yeah, interesting. I don't think anybody has done a plot like this exactly to represent kind of a radius away from the pile, what's going on and how much the ground is being strained at different distances, vertically and horizontally. And so moving on to our second structure where we had an opportunity to drive piles really close in. This is the Longworth Hall, also in Cincinnati. And the portion that we see here right in the middle is a newer portion of this historic structure that's getting demolished for the construction of the new Brent Spence Bridge going across the river there. So the more historic structure that's on the right side, you can see the older brick is getting preserved, but this newer portion that was built, I think, in the 70s is getting removed for the construction of the bridge, because the new bridge is going to go right through where this part of the building is now. And so we did a similar instrumentation kind of study at this structure too, but with a 4-story building instead of a smaller house. The main difference at this site was that the ground was a much weaker silt and clay mix, and there was no rock to go down to. We just got the soil test results back this week, and it was mainly silt and clay with N counts in single digits, all the way down to about 45 feet or so. So it was really weak soil. And then around 45 feet to 60 feet, it had a little bit of gravel in it, so the N counts went up to 20 to 25 or so. But yeah, much weaker soil here. And so they're going to be driving piles, I think, for the construction of the new bridge. So interesting information for ODOT. They wanted to know, Ohio DOT, what was kind of going on this site. And we wanted to know how that kind of weaker ground changed the vibrations that were being created by the pile driving. Because the vibrations that are created from the pile, even though you have a constant energy input at the top of the pile, the vibration that that energy input gets distributed into actually moving the pile into the ground and also into creating the vibration. And when the pile resistance is higher, then it doesn't move as much, which means that more vibration is created. But when you have weaker soil like this, then the pile just goes down more with each hit and less vibration is created. So yeah, we had a vertical array of geophones at this site down to 60 feet in this case, because that's how deep we were driving the piles. At the 4-story building, we had global strain and geophones on each floor. So we're going to be calculating interstory drift between each of the 4 different stories and as a structure as a whole to see kind of where the worst case strain is going to be. We had crack gauges inside and also on the brick exterior. and then subsurface soil samples, blow counts, wave speed measurements, and then a new type of instrument that we got to do at this site because below about 30 feet or so, it was saturated ground below the water table, is that Geosonics put down some piezometers to measure the water pressure in the borehole and to see how it changed with pile driving just 5 feet away. So these were the type of piles. They were closed and pipe piles. We drove them first with the impact hammer and then vibratory extracted some of them, or all of them, and then vibratory drove a couple of them. See the difference with that. And down to 60 feet depth. The closest pile was impacted 3 foot 10 inches from the building. And so the picture here, you can see really how close that is. It's just right up, like almost physically as close as we could get to the building itself. And because the soil was so much weaker, there was so much less resistance than the other house. Even so the pile was 3 foot 10 inches away from the building, but the sensors we had, there wasn't enough room to put it between the building and the structure. So the surface compliance sensors in this case were 6.3 feet away from the impact pile. And at 6.3 feet, the vibrations were just slightly above the USBM curve. And so, yeah, even though they were a bigger, more blunt-ended pile with the same type of hammer, the vibrations were significantly less at this site because the ground was weaker. So especially that top 45 feet where the end counts were just single digits, the pile just went in really easily and didn't create that much vibration. And then vibratory driving in this soft ground too, it did not even go over the US Bureau of Mines limit, 6.4 feet away. So, yep, 6.4 feet just below the drywall limit. Kind of surprisingly low level of vibration from this one. So our next steps are going to be analyzing the data. We were just there for 2 days, but we generated 10,000 vibration events from the 11 different geophones that were on the structure and in the ground. We're still waiting to get back some of the final results from the other companies that were involved doing the PDA and the wave speed and everything else. It's going to be really interesting to see how the pore pressure reacted. I know that I can't remember exactly the numbers, but they had some preliminary results we could see the day of that it rose maybe 1 or 2 psi, and then it took overnight to the next day for it to kind of slowly return back to the original pressure before the pile driving. So that'll be really interesting to see. And then we're going to calculate the global strain on the building, kind of see how that tracked with the depth of the pile going in. And at which story we saw the highest strain. And then I do want to generate the same type of ground strain profile at this site that we did for the other one and see kind of where the maximum are, see even if some of the regions here got above that kind of high risk of settlement region above 1,000 microstrain in the ground. So yep, a lot of analysis to do here. We'll be working on it for a while. And future testing, I think we got a pretty good amount of structure response information here, driving next to that house in kind of a worst case spot where we could generate basically the highest possible level of vibration from any type of pile driving, just because we were bashing the piles right into the rock with maximum resistance. But we do want to find a sandy site where we can actually study settlement potential, maybe with or without a structure nearby, and just measure the ground strain at different distances and depths, and then actually observe what the surface is doing in a sandy ground condition to see if these regions of ground strain do correlate with observed settlement on the surface, and then kind of see what that looks like at depth. Because yeah, there hasn't been a lot of actual study of what's going on with vibrations deeper into the ground. Most of the time, people just put out geophones right on the surface next to the pile driving, but we really want to see what's going on as the pile gets deeper and at different layers if there are some stratifications in the ground. So yep, looking forward to that. I think we still have a bit more to do as a study as a whole, but yeah, some good results so far. And yep, here's the whole crew that was at the Ohio, the Rumpke house. And Kathy was one taking the picture, so she was real instrumental there too. Yeah, it was a really big collaboration. A lot of different companies and teams were involved, gathering all those different types of data. And then obviously the whole pile driving crew from Gottle there was really good. So yeah, I think we have a lot more to study here, a lot more that we can glean from this mountain of information we gathered at the couple sites. And if any grad students are out there want to analyze some of this data, we can talk about it and help out with that too. Some interesting papers could be had for sure. Please contact me with any questions or kind of information that you want to share with me, or if you have any kind of sandy sites that you're going to be pile driving at, we can come out and put some instruments out too. So yep, my email and phone number is there. And that's going to conclude it for me. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Brent. Thank you, Kathy. The question and answers are open, so please pass those questions on. We have a little bit more time with Brent and Kathy. So I have a few questions. So for surface monitoring, how deep do you, or what's the recommendation for where you place surface monitors? Because I see them sort of placed, I don't know, willy-nilly, I'd say.
For the appliance next to the structure?
For pile driving, how deep do you place it for starters? If you just have a surface one, is it any depth in the ground, or is it?
No, the recommended depth is 3 times the height of the geophone, which ends up being like 8 or 9 inches.
Okay.
And it's just enough so that you can dig a hole about the width of the width of a shovel, put the geophone in there, and then pack it in really good so that the geophone is really well coupled to the ground, so that the vibration is transmitted and moved. The geophone is actually representing the movement of the ground, and not like on the surface. If you just put the geophone just sitting on the ground, it can move more than the ground is doing. So coupling of the sensors is really important.
Travis, I'd like to make some comments and verify and clarify maybe some of the things that were discussed. I think it's very important for the audience to understand that there are no vibration criteria to prevent damage in structures for continuous vibrations such as pile driving. The criteria that we allude to are the U.S. Bureau of Mines standards that were developed for blasting. And blasting is a transient kind of force. It's not a continuous force. There are no criteria for potential damage. And the Bureau of Mines developed that for what they called safe blasting criteria. It wasn't based on damage per se, but it is something that has been adopted by the pile driving industry and other construction industries as law, regulation, if you will. It is very conservative, and I do want to say that it's and you listen to Brent. He was standing in that bedroom and he could barely focus, he said, but the water in the cup was hardly moving. So the structure wasn't moving, but it sure bothered Brent. And that's why we get complaints. People are more sensitive than structures, in other words. That's very important to understand.
How sensitive is driving to the size of the hammer you use? Because you said that greater pile movement is less vibration. So larger hammer, lower vibrations. Is that
maybe,
not? It's probably not that straightforward, right?
We haven't tested that one specifically, but maybe, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, well, yes, we've done a lot of pile driving with different energy levels. Certainly, the higher the energy level, the more the vibrations near the surface. That's something we've been studying for 25 years, and it's a fact. But what happens down deep is really what's important. So that's where the strains normalize, if you will.
Okay. So it appears that the weaker the soil, the lower the vibrations. So to reduce vibrations, pre-augering and operating the hammer at a lower stroke would lower your stay within those limits.
Yes, we pre-augured before, and it does make a big difference. Yes. Absolutely. But it all depends on the soil. But this was, I mean, this loose sand and gravel was ideal, actually, next to a historic structure. Yeah.
Is the strain that the micro strain that the building feels, is that the more important criteria than the vibration?
Yeah, the Bureau of Mines, when they came up with the criteria, they related the strain in the building to PPV measurements in the ground outside.
Right.
The true representation of the cracking is the strain that's experienced, because that's how much the materials in the building are actually stretching.
Mm-hmm.
So that a 200 microstrain for the drywall is a much truer representation of how much it takes to crack it, rather than the PPV limit outside. And that's borne through by this this house at the Rumpke Quarry, was that we went way over the limit, but the strain was still pretty low on the inside.
I think something to consider is, and I always say this to every audience, structures don't care how fast they vibrate. Vibration levels, or the speed at which the structure is moving, that doesn't cause cracking. What causes cracking is displacement, which is a function of velocity and frequency. We forget about frequency. So displacement that relates directly to strain and cracking potential is a function of velocity divided by frequency. The higher the frequency, the lower the strain. Very simple. Blasting is high frequency, so the strain levels are pretty low. So that's a very important relationship to understand. If we can change the frequency, we can certainly change the strains in the wall. And I think another thing that he noted, I think, and this is true, the highest vibration doesn't give you the highest strain, and that's because of frequency. So frequency content is very, very important.
Yeah, the vibratory hammer at the house was not a variable moment hammer. So that's why the worst vibration, or the worst strains, were from the startup of the hammer, when the frequencies are kind of worst case closer to the natural frequency of the house, but the energy is still there. That's why they invented variable moment hammers, was to reduce the energy while you're in the bad frequency region, and then once it gets up to full speed, then increase the energy.
Okay.
I think another important thing is that the damage potential that we talk about, the strain, the 200 microstrain for drywall and plaster that we learned from Brazil, those come from laboratory testing, not actual field experiments, because we can't crack with our equipment. We're not cracking with our blasting. We had to take it to the lab and cause shaking. And so it's what it is. That's what we have to rely on. We've never seen, well, we have seen, I should say, Brent and I had a job at a quarry in Florida, where it took up to 10 inches per second ground vibration to induce strain to crack mortar material on the walls. 10 inches per second is a lot higher than 2. And that's realistic. It's very unusual to be able to do that with the structure that will be demolished. We are now doing, how many, Brent? We have another structure in Kentucky that will be demolished at a quarry, and we're taking the blasting right up to the house to crack it. So we're learning, we're getting it, we're getting there.
You're gonna break it eventually?
I hope so. But you can't do it with pile driving. That's the problem. That's what we're learning. Pile driving is not like blasting.
Okay. If there's a minimal transition in vibrations from soil to rock, then if you were working adjacent to a structure that's founded on the rock, then you have less vibration concerns. Is that right?
For pile driving, yes. Yeah, because you're not going to drive through that rock. You're going to drive to that rock.
There's still going to be some soil around the foundation on top of the rock.
Right.
Uh-huh.
There will be transmission through the soil into the foundation there. There's not many structures that are just purely right on top of the rock with nothing else around it.
Yeah, right.
But I think the bottom line is pile driving can be done safely and protective of structures. Bottom line. And that's a good message to the pile driving industry.
Yeah, that's something that they're
exactly
trying to figure out how to get out there.
What do you do about complaints? That's what drives us crazy, when people complain. And for the fear of structure damage, how do you translate that into, or dumb down the science so property owners and structure owners understand that we're not damaging the structures? How do you do that? We do it with science, but how do you translate that science down so people understand? More podcasts, right? More webinars.
So you could inform people that what the vibrations they feel are insignificant relative to the structure, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
that's the message you need to get out. Is that
exactly? Absolutely. And what we do in the blasting industry is many of the blasting companies or communities develop brochures and pamphlets to educate. And then you have community meetings. I know it's a little onerous, but it does help. You need to educate the community and the people.
Yeah, to put it in perspective, the level that people can feel at the lowest level of vibration is about 0.02 inches per second.
Right.
Whereas the drywall level begins at 0.75 up to 2 inches per second. So
Right.
people can feel levels about 25 times less than the normal limit we use for drywall. So we try to explain that to them, that there is a region where you're going to feel it, but with the science, we know that it is safe for the structure.
People make great seismographs.
Well, that's really powerful information for people concerned about their structures, huh?
It is. More public education. That's the bottom line.
And that's why we measure it with calibrated instruments to actually put some real numbers to it.
Yeah.
There's a couple more questions. I believe they're relating to the Bureau of Mines criteria. So frequency is more important. So why is there only thresholds for particle velocity?
Well, the limit is a combination of PPV and frequency.
But these are sensors we make, right, Brent? We only make velocity sensors. We don't make displacement. So you have to use velocity.
They're asking about frequency though. But yeah, the limit is a combination of PPV and frequency. So at lower frequencies, the limit is 0.75 for drywall, but at higher frequencies up to 40 hertz, it kind of ramps up to 2 inches per second. So frequency is included in the limit for drywall. It's not just PPV.
And if you can see the questions answered, there's a final, or the last question posted is something in the same vein that I'll follow up if I try to read it to you. Can you see
doesn't the USBM present strain as a limit? Or displacement? I mean, Kathy, you helped with some of that research back there in the 80s with the Bureau of Mines. So why do we why do we use velocity as a limit instead of displacement or strain?
I wish we could. I wish we could use displacement, but we don't make displacement gauges. Displacement gauges mean that you have to keep one of the gauges steady while the other one moves. It's a differential there. We only make velocity gauges, so we have to use velocity as our measurement tool. And then from that, we can calculate displacement for strains. Unfortunately, that's the way the world works. So, yeah.
As far as the
strain-based criteria, I mean, look at what we've been able to do. New York City is now strain-based. The criteria for blasting in New York City is all based on strain, based on the research Brent and I have been doing there for the past 10 years. And we're hoping that strain-based criteria can be imposed elsewhere because it makes a lot more sense.
One of the problems with the strain in the structure, if you have that as a criteria though, is that you do actually have to measure the structure response. And so, which means you have to put sensors on the building, which is difficult. Sometimes structure owners don't let you in the building. And so the only way that you can measure is outside the building in the ground between the source of vibration and the structure. So that's, another reason why we use PPV in the ground at the limit rather than actual strain in the building, just from a practical sensor location standpoint.
So if you had strain-based criteria and you had a friendly owner that would let you do what you want, where would you put them?
Yeah, we put them
on every floor, every wall.
Yeah, no, just on the top and on the bottom. And we're doing that in Washington, D.C. right now for the Potomac River cleanup. It really is, I have always found that structure owners want to be a part of this response studies. And so we've always been able to find structures that allow us to do that. we've never had any difficulties doing this, but as Brent says, not everybody is amenable to allowing you to put sensors on top of their buildings.
Yeah, we're doing a big project in downtown Denver right now, and there's a lot of building owners that we just never heard back from any kind of communication at all. So the only place that we can put a sensor is on the sidewalk right
Yeah.
outside the building,
Yeah.
because there's no ground, there's nothing but building, sidewalk, and the road where the construction is. So placing the sensor is tough sometimes.
With enough data, you can model that though. Knowing what the structure amplification factors are, you know that it's about 3 to 4 times on the top than it is in the ground. And you can estimate what the strains are. But like he says, the strains are only 30 or 40 microstrains, where the damage occurs at thousands of microstrains. So really, it's a kind of a moot point. Modeling is probably the best way to go in that regard, and rely on actual measurements elsewhere.
Yeah, are you asking questions in the chat here too? Or did you give your Zoom link to somebody else?
Yes. Yeah, yeah, he did. I got a message about switching names over, but yeah, she's not asking her own questions. Is it safe to say the vibration from pile driving can cause damage, but it doesn't cause damage to the extent that people think it causes?
Right.
But does it cause damage?
Pile driving?
Yeah.
I've not seen it yet. We haven't seen it.
Okay.
I mean, Brent showed what happened with an existing crack, especially against gravity, with gravity.
Uh-huh.
It'd fall a little bit, but we didn't get any new cracks in the drywall material. But distress, like he says, with an existing crack. And that can happen.
So for this audience, pile driving does not cause damage.
I'll be the first to say that. And I'll stand by it.
That's excellent.
Yeah.
I think that's the end of the questions that have been posted. So
somebody was asking for the contact information up there again. Can we put the presentation back up, just in case anyone else needs my email? And feel free to email me, and I can pass along to Kathy if you have questions for Kathy also.
There was a question about where they can find the session. I believe DFI posts these on I think they have a YouTube channel that these are posted at. So you will see it at some point.
Yes, we have a YouTube channel that you can watch all the webinars on.
Well, thanks so much to both of you. That was very interesting. Like I said, it's something that's been often discussed within the committee, and this is some valuable information to support our perceptions, or what we hope.
Exactly. That's what it's all about.
So thank you again for your time, and thanks to all of our attendees. And the final impact of 2025 will be after DFI annual. It will be November 5th.
Thank you, Travis.
Thank you.
Thank you all for the time.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you.